Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through the A-level specification on attachment and looking at specifically Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. This is a section of the course that kind of is exploring this idea that, okay, so we've looked at attachment and looked at the different types. We kind of understand the importance of it. Kind of what happens if there is a potential concern or problem with that attachment, whether it doesn't form, or potentially in this particular case it's called maternal deprivation, if one is deprived from the child. Some people do find it slightly difficult to kind of see that we have two parts of the course that involve Bowlby, but they are to be kind of separated. Of course, we can draw upon our understanding of attachment in both, but they are kind of seen as being separate. One of the key things is potentially that this deprivation part of the course would have been some of Bowlby's earlier work, and actually it's quite ironic that we do this kind of later in the course. But he has a key term in terms of deprivation. It's kind of having something taken away. Having something taken away. And so what is really important here, we do recognize that it's attachment that's been taken away. So this is an attachment bond that has been formed that ultimately gets disrupted because of some particular situation in terms of their care. Now, of course, there's lots of kind of reasons why a child may be deprived. Bowlby certainly later on in his theories to talk about kind of having zero kind of opportunity to leave the mother. But of course, deprivation happens kind of for kind of tragic reasons in terms of kind of personal circumstances, but also because of things that cannot be kind of helped. And certainly, I hope that you remember part of kind of the Robertson's kind of study that talks about emotional substitute care being a really important part. So, some people could argue that, as a parent goes to work and takes their child to a childminder, that depriving their child of care. But of course, if they have that substitute care, then they're not missing out in attachment. But in terms of Bowlby's kind of theory, as I said, it was one of his earlier things. So before we even have a look at this, we have this key study by Bowlby called The 44 Thieves, quite conveniently kind of published in 1944, and they tried to find a link between the affectionist psychopath and maternal deprivation. I will explain exactly what this affectionist psychopath is. Obviously, affectionless means without affection, and psychopathy is kind of this this lack of understanding of kind of right and wrong, and it's saying that there's a link to this to maternal deprivation. Now, in this, there's the actual definition there: inability to feel affection or care about others, and no understanding of social conscience. Okay, so. It took 44 criminal teenagers that had all been kind of accused of stealing, hence the 44 Thieves kind of name for this. What we had a look at is they were interviewed, a whole bunch of data was collected, they were kind of looked at other types of kind of signs, as I said, things like their lack of affection, perhaps if they didn't feel guilt about their actions or empathy for the victims. Ultimately, kind of a lot of it would have been kind of qualitative data, collecting about kind of them from their families, from themselves, and from all of kind of the people around them. But we also looked to see whether they had any prolonged early separations. So, of course, this is something which maybe you kind of think that, well, Bowlby is trying to kind of find what he was looking for. But he did try and have a control group as well. These were non-criminals, but children who perhaps had emotional difficulties. It says here that they're emotionally disturbed. And we wanted to see if there was also separation from their mothers or any form of deprivation. And that's important. He's kind of comparing the two groups. And what we find is that there's actually quite a significant large amount of these children who are seen as affectionist psychopaths, 14 out of 44, you would expect perhaps none of them to be, or if you kind of lucky to find one, so to speak. But he found 14 of them were. And also we see quite significantly that 12 of them had actually had prolonged separation from their mothers in their first couple of years. But in contrast, there were only 5 of the remaining thieves had experienced separation. So in other words, there's a much larger group of children who've got prolonged separation and ultimately end up being affectionist psychopaths. And so he concluded that prolonged early separation caused affectionist psychopathy. So he takes this theory and kind of makes a very strong statement about this idea that if you're separated from your maternal carer, that there's a chance that there's going to be problems in terms of the affectionist psychopathy. And from that he then publishes his work in 1951 called the Maternal Deprivation hypothesis. Now this is significantly earlier than his attachment theories, but he is definitely trying to kind of work on this understanding that if you're deprived from your maternal mother, that there's going to be a problem. And this is what he says. It says that the continual presence of nurture from the mother is essential for normal development. So he kind of goes on to say later that kind of this mother love is kind of important, as important as vitamins are needed in order to survive. So this is what he see. So that's the quote there. Mother love in infancy is important as vitamins are for physical health. So he goes on to kind of state in his theory that being separated from the mother has serious consequences. This is his hypothesis. Okay, so according to the theory, being separated from the mother has consequences. So we obviously need to be able to talk about this. The consequences are quite clear. The first one is short term. This will be your PDD model. So if you've listened to the previous video, you'll kind of see the protest, despair, detachment kind of aspect, that children naturally kind of don't want to leave that attachment figure. But he also noted that they were clingy, aggressive and attention seeking in this. So these are kind of your short-term consequences of being deprived of care. But probably more worrying was the long-term effect, where he says that this could result in depression. Certainly from his 44 Thieves study, he talks about delinquency and ultimately affectionist psychopathy. So the theory in itself is genuinely quite simple and straightforward, and that's all we need to kind of talk about. We need to focus on kind of the short term and long term, and talk about this idea that you need to kind of, you know, have that maternal care. We do also just kind of have the kind of final aspect of this. This is where he works on his 2.5 year. He often mentions a lot of different time frames, but he kind of develops this idea of critical period quite early on, and saying that if separations before this time can pretty much kind of be problematic and disrupt the bond. And he actually kind of goes on to clarify the difficulty of maternal deprivation. He says you need to be careful until the child is 5, but I suppose the most important thing is, he said, it's irreversible. So in other words, he's kind of saying that this disruption of attachment, this maternal deprivation, is so bad that it's irreversible. Now, in criticism of this, we have some real concerns. It's a real concern that they kind of focusing on this in the specification, because we see that the evidence is weak. Okay, now he drew a lot of his evidence from the 44 Thieves. He does his work on these children, and certainly he is affected by these children, the work that he's done with them. He also kind of worked on with a person called Goldfarb, and this was a group of children who showed to have lower IQs, kind of living in institutions. And so he kind of, this early kind of work was quite important to Bowlby. But we have some major problems with this particular research. First of all, is that they're war orphans, and and they were ultimately traumatized by more than just disruption from attachment. So that poor aftercare, and that's really, really important, because if we look from Robertson later on, talking about a good substitute emotional care, these children wouldn't have had it. And they're also growing up in poor quality institutions, so kind of that almost stereotypical kind of children's home we're talking about. Kind of one of the reasons we don't have those children's homes is because of the work of Robertson, where they showed kind of having that emotional bond with somebody is really important. So it's not just maternal care that affected these children, and of course, but Bowlby is drawing quite a lot of strong conclusions from that. And so we can see that these factors could actually be the reason. So you could even look at something called determinism, where it's kind of saying if the children is in the circumstance, this is the outcome they're going to be. And of course, it's not, because they are choices, and sometimes those choices are down to other factors. Or you could even argue that it's reductionist. It's these other factors that cause difficulty rather than the separation. Then we could be quite critical just about the 44 Thieves study in itself. Bowlby carried the work out himself, okay, and he was kind of thinking about affectionist psychopathy, and therefore he could have been biased. Ultimately, he found what he's looking for in terms of the 44 Thieves. And just to kind of represent this, Hilda Lewis did work in a much kind of larger kind of group with 500 young people, to trying to see if there is this link between kind of thievery or kind of some kind of delinquency and a separation, and she couldn't do any of it. They all had a history of prolonged early separation, but it did not predict criminality or forming difficult relationships. So ultimately, we can't kind of find the same kind of evidence as what Bowlby has. So it suggests that there could be other factors that affect the outcome of early maternal deprivation. We have other studies that kind of say that we need to think about what it could be. Sometimes it's multiple factors rather than just one thing. Now, the kind of last kind of aspect that is kind of going to be important before we move on to the Romanian orphans is it says that sometimes we have two terms, deprivation and privation. Now, privation is the lack of necessities. So this is a bit of the situation where you don't have attachment. And it seems that, of course, if you don't have emotional care, you're unlikely to form an attachment. So if you don't have emotional care, you're unlikely to form an attachment. And this is privation. And Rutter said that when Bowlby talked about deprivation, he was muddling the two concepts, that he should have really been talking about privation rather than deprivation. So he draws this distinction between the two, and he says that failure to form an attachment is a lot more kind of critical than disruption of attachment. It says here, severe long-term damage Bowlby associated with deprivation was actually more likely to be the result of privation. So when we look at children in that situation of not having formed an attachment, they're more likely to go and to kind of have negative consequences. Back to my argument about Tom Riddle versus Harry Potter, the negative consequences is because of the lack of emotional care and privation rather than deprivation. At this particular stage, I don't want to diminish the fact that severe disruptions or certainly repeated disruptions may not be problematic, and there's a very, very good film called A Home for Maisie, and that's the website. You can't actually find the video on YouTube very easily. You might be able to find some documentaries, but you do see that actually having that kind of combination of privation, deprivation and disruption of attachment can actually be really, really damaging. We see this person, Maisie, who struggles through this, where she's had several carers over a short period of time, and how difficult she is for these people who adopted, and now it's their 9th child that they're adopting. They're very experienced and very loving and caring, but it's only with good psychological care that they ultimately have a positive outcome, and definitely would recommend you having a look at that. I hope you've enjoyed this little video. I'll continue with the attachment topic and post videos as often as I can. Take care and speak to you soon. Okay, bye.